Well, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the Nieman Foundation for this honor, and especially Bill and Myra and Anne-Marie for thinking that I deserved it. It's a special honor for me because I admired I.F. Stone's independent journalism so much. As Bill mentioned, that when I was at Colby College, I even lobbied the school library to subscribe to his newsletter. Reading it weekly shaped how I came to view journalism as a profession that required endless skepticism. And I had the privilege of meeting him once in the early 1980s. I was an investigative reporter then for the Associated Press in Washington. I had gotten hold of some documents, some classified documents about financial misconduct in El Salvador. He called and asked if he could come and read the documents, and so I said sure, and he showed up at the AP office on K Street, and through his thick glasses, and I think he might have had a magnifying glass too at the time, he spent a couple of hours poring through those papers. So I shared Izzy Stone's view that journalists should be the consummate outsiders. I spent my first part of my career as a mainstream journalist, but I never forgot his insistence on maintaining your independence at all costs, whatever the pressures. To me, the core responsibility of a journalist is to have an open mind toward any information you might find, to have no agenda, and to have no preferred outcome. In other words, I don't care what the truth is, I just care what the truth is. That's the deal you make with your readers. You have to follow the leads wherever they go. I also consider this award a recognition of what we've accomplished at consortiumnews.com over the past 2 decades. This honor goes to the many talented reporters and analysts who have written for us. They have made Consortium News a place where you can find thoughtful, well-researched, well-reported information, stories well worth reading almost every single day. And for those of you who don't know much about Consortium News, let me give you a brief history. The project began out of my frustration with the mainstream news media where I'd spent many years. I worked at the AP from 1974 to 1987. I was perhaps best known for breaking many of the stories we now know as the Iran-Contra scandal. These included the first article about a little-known Marine officer named Oliver North, and with my AP colleague Brian Barger, the first story about how some of the Nicaraguan Contra rebels had gotten themselves mixed up in the drug trade. To say that these and other stories weren't always popular would be a bit of an understatement. But they were well reported, and they were borne out when the Iran-Contra scandal exploded in late 1986. I then got a job offer from Newsweek, and I felt it was time to move on. Sadly, I'd burned many bridges at the AP in the fights to push our stories to the wire. But what I found at Newsweek was even more troubling. There was an allegiance more to the powerful than to the public. At senior levels, there was a stubborn reluctance to pursue the Iran-Contra scandal to its roots, out of fear that it could destroy another Republican president. This may sound odd, but the attitude inside Newsweek, which was then part of the Washington Post company, was that we don't need another Watergate. They did not want another constitutional crisis that was not deemed good for the country. So I left Newsweek in 1990 and worked on some documentaries for PBS Frontline. But it was becoming increasingly clear to me that the space for serious investigative journalism was closing down. With the arrival of Bill Clinton, there was a market for silly, tawdry scandals, but there was even less interest in the unsolved mysteries of the 1980s. These were old-fashioned, complicated stories without much sex. But a key moment occurred in late 1994, when I got access to the raw files of a congressional inquiry into an Iran-Contra spin-off scandal known generically as the October Surprise. This was really an issue of whether or not the Iran-Contra, the sales of arms by the US government to the Iranians had really begun not in 1985 and 1986 as the official story was, but much earlier, that they'd begun back in 1981. And according to a number of well-placed sources, including people like Assistant Secretary of State Nick Veliotis. These arrangements really grew out of the Republican campaign in 1980 when Republicans were making behind-the-scenes contacts with the Iranians without President Carter's knowledge. So these documents were quite interesting, and they've been, the investigation had ended in sort of a non-committal way. They couldn't find really evidence to support that these events had occurred. So they basically just wrapped it up at the beginning of the Clinton administration and said, well, there's not really hard evidence here. But they left behind a number of their records. And in late 1994, after the Republicans had won the control of the Congress but hadn't yet taken over, I thought it would be a good time perhaps to get hold of whatever documents they had left behind. So I got permission from the House Foreign Affairs Committee to go look at their unpublished records, supposedly obviously unclassified stuff. And they led me. I'd covered Congress for a number of years, but they led me to a place I never knew existed in Congress. I went into the Rayburn building on Capitol Hill, down an elevator, into the parking garage, and had to wind my way through a parking garage, and they'd put up sort of some makeshift office space in the garage. And so I knocked on the door, and this young guy came and let me in. And he said, oh yes, I heard you were coming, and I'm told you can look at these documents. You can make copies of only 12 pages. They had an old copying machine. And he led me through this little warren of offices, where basically just him and me, into an abandoned ladies' room. And this is how your government sort of works. So in the ladies' room, there was even an empty tampon dispenser on the wall. They had piled all these boxes on the floor. And so I sat down and started opening up the boxes, and the young fellow, was just before Christmas, he was talking to his girlfriend on the phone. And I opened up the boxes, and I began to realize that they had left behind secret and top secret material. So I volunteered to make the copies myself. And it was one of those old, big, lumbering copy machines that you don't see anymore, but they were back then. You would see them, and so I sort of covered the red top secret stamps all over these things, and began putting them into the machine. And it kept jamming, but I kept saying, I know how these machines work. I can take care of it. So I made my 12 copies or whatever I was allowed, and then I sort of snuck them out, left Capitol Hill, and then I went back a couple times to get my number 12 pages. So over a couple of weeks, I was able to get a number of interesting documents, which I thought sort of changed how we'd understand the 1980s. But I prepared a report summarizing what the documents showed, but I kept running into disinterest among the major news organizations that I tried to get them to, and even some that weren't that major. So the feeling was that this was just an utter frustration of trying to deal with issues that people thought were historical. They didn't really care that much anymore. So one day in 1995, I was complaining about this, and my oldest son, Sam, who had just finished college, was home, and he said, Dad, instead of complaining, why don't you go to the internet, and they have things they call websites, and we can publish them. So I said, well, I really didn't know the internet. I'd heard about it. And Sam was not a techie, but he set out, and back then there were no templates. You had to basically build it from scratch. So we had a rather rustic-looking internet site, but we began publishing these secret and top secret documents and the stories that derived from them. So that was the beginning of consortiumnews.com 20 years ago. It actually started in November of 1995, so we're just about at the 20th birthday of our little project. And the original idea was to provide a home for neglected investigative journalists in their work. I thought I could raise significant amounts of money from a variety of sources, thus the rather clunky name Consortium News. But I soon learned that independent journalism, while it's popular in the abstract, is not something people really want to invest much in. They prefer to know how the stories are going to end up before they give you the money. So we always struggled with money, but we did build a loyal readership. We kept this going with small donations mostly. To my pleasant surprise, I also discovered that a number of ex-CIA analysts were looking for a place to publish their work. They shared our concern that the United States was veering away from fact-based policies. They felt that this decoupling from reality was careening the country toward international catastrophes, and they were right. I'd be happy to respond to any specific issues that we've dealt with over the past 2 decades, from world affairs to domestic politics, but suffice it to say that what we mostly do is take on mindless groupthinks, of which there are many in official Washington. We are relentlessly independent. That may not make us popular with some people, but I think I.F. Stone would approve.
You know, it is really rare these days for me to think about a journalist and look at him or her and think to myself, that journalist is a real badass. But in the most admiring terms, you're a badass. And we need a lot more badass journalists. And I couldn't be prouder to sit here with you. I really congratulate you. Are you in the mood to tell more stories? Because I have questions that I just love to, I kind of imagine we all would. Would you take us back to the mid-'80s and how you figured out the CIA-Contra cocaine connection, how that came to light?
Sure. For people who may not have followed all this, and some of the younger people who may think this is like really old stuff, basically, by the mid-1980s, by 84, 85, it had become clear that the Congress was trying to stop this war in Nicaragua. And Congress passed legislation, generally called the Bowen Amendment, which prohibited, in various ways, the U.S. government from providing support to the Contras. But the Contras kept operating. So first alone, I set out to try to figure out how they were doing that. Later on, I was joined by a very talented colleague, Brian Barger. And what we discovered over time was that there were a number of secret sources of money. We were basically just following the money. And we weren't looking for the drugs. That was a bit of a surprise, frankly. But we had found out that they were getting money from private donors. They were getting money from
American donors?
American donors, but also from third country donors. That this was being organized out of the White House in defiance of Congress. And that as we went further into this, it also became clear that a number of the Contras, actually all the major Contra groups, were benefiting as well from the profits of the drug trade.
Would you take us right into the grit of that? Because that's the kind of reporting that we don't get enough of these days. How did you figure each of those things out, and in particular the drug piece?
Well, there obviously, a lot of it was dealing with sources, and we spent a great deal of time getting to know the Contras.
Were you down there a lot? Were you down from Washington, both?
The great thing about the Contras, at least the great thing from my perspective, was that they weren't really in Nicaragua much, or in Honduras. They mostly were in Miami. So, and this is a little bit...
It's a life, but someone had to leave.
I know, but working at the Associated Press, you could do some domestic travel. AP's not very much big on paying people for trips. So, but I could maybe arrange to get trips domestically. To get trips overseas required going through a lot more hoops. And so, so it was very handy that the Contras were in Miami. I could, especially on a February, wintry kind of week, I could say I must go talk to the Contras, and I'd fly down and rent a car and drive along Biscayne Boulevard and go out and meet with the Contras, who had very nice houses usually, some condos, and they lived in Coconut Grove and other places. And we'd hang out, and we'd have dinner, and we'd talk, and they would
I was thinking muddy boots and boats
Yeah,
on
well.
rivers and apocalypse now.
But essentially, they would like rat on each other. They'd be like one guy saying, "I didn't get this. I didn't get any help. The CIA was helping this guy, not that guy." You know, so by getting to know the Contras that well and developing those relationships, that was a way to find out a lot of secrets about them. And then some of them began to talk about how some of their people were, often the people they did not like, were involved in the drug trade. And then we went further into this. There was also a case of Hugo Spadafora, who was a Panamanian official who had tried to blow the whistle on some of the Contras being involved in the drug trade, and he was then kidnapped and executed. His body was found in Panama, and his family was also interested in trying to keep that alive. And there were investigations done in Costa Rica. Barger and I did go down to Costa Rica to spend time talking to DEA officials and talking to members of the government. So over time, we pieced together a great deal. And one of our techniques in that whole affair was to try to develop the information in, whether it be Miami or Central America, and then come back and talk to people in Washington, who we also had developed a lot of sources with. And you could bounce things off them. And you could also help people in Washington understand what was happening down there. So some members of Congress or members of their staffs, or even people inside the Reagan administration itself, would be interested in talking to you because you were actually bringing things back. And one of the tactics we used, because you didn't want to burn any one source, if you talked to enough people, and they started talking among themselves and checking things out, then you could go back and sort of harvest the information. And it would not pin to one person particularly. So it was a way to also protect sources. But out of all that, we developed detailed knowledge of what the Contras were up to and how they were doing their business. And one story that we prepared in December of 1985 was the story of the Contra drug trade. But at that point, we also had, I'd gone to, I really still probably shouldn't use his name, but a senior official in the National Security Council who confirmed much of it based on CIA documents. The CIA was well aware of what was happening.
How direct was their hand in the actual trade, or was it merely an umbrella or protection of the CIA?
Contras or the CIA?
The CIA, excuse me.
Well, I think the evidence suggests that the CIA, the evidence doesn't suggest, it says at this point, that the Contras became involved in the drug trade as early as 1980, back at the very beginning of their movement.
Directed toward it by the CIA? They were looking for money. They went all the way to Iran to find money.
Well, the history is it goes back a little further because it goes back to 1980 where there was what was called the cocaine coup in Bolivia. And the cocaine coup in Bolivia was organized in part by the Argentine intelligence services. The Argentines had taken on for themselves this idea they were going to rid the continent of leftist movements. So they supported a right-wing coup in Bolivia, but it also was involved with the drug traffickers. There was many of the officers were also related and connected to the drug trade in Bolivia. That provided a secure source of coca paste, which was then brought to a city called Medellin in Colombia. And this is the birth of the Medellin cartel. That's how they got going. Now, those Argentine intelligence officers then moved on to Honduras, where they used some of the proceeds from the drug trade to help found the Contras. The Contras were really founded by the Argentine intelligence service.
Was the CIA engaged at that point?
At that point, not really. That was in 1980. It was still Jimmy Carter's presidency. By 81, 82, the CIA is in there, and ultimately the agency takes over the Contras because in Argentina there's a collapse of the military government. So the Contras were already into the drug trade when the CIA sort of shows up. But the agency was aware, based on even their own admissions now from their Inspector General's report in 1998, that the Contras were in key people across the board. They were deeply involved in the drug trade.
How important was the cocaine money as opposed to the Iran money?
Probably was much more important. The Iran money was rather secondary, came in rather late. That was 85, 86. And it's never been clear exactly how much ultimately got through to the Contras. Some did, but some also ended up in the pockets of some of the middlemen. General Secord bought himself the fancy sports car with some of the money. So you had this pieces of it disappearing as it moved toward the Contras. But the drug trafficking was something that was important for them, really from the start all the way through 1990, when the war basically ended.
And to put this in the context of its reception, then, can you recount for us a time or two, or when you took this, you were at AP, when you would take this to your bosses there and say, let's go, can you, in a kind of granular way, describe some of those interactions? Who, at least by position, you might have been talking with and what their response was? I mean, this is where it really gets gritty. They weren't prepared always to run with these.
Well, the AP did not have a real history of doing investigative journalism. They had Cy Hirsch used to work for AP.
Why did they have a special unit then?
Well, because Wes Gallagher, who was the general manager of the AP back really when I first started there, he did want to have something special. And so he put together a special assignment team. And then it shrank and shrank and shrank. By the time I got there were only 4 people on it, and only one of us was doing investigative reporting. But they kept it alive, sort of in his memory almost by that point. But AP was known for spot news and breaking stories and being on top of things. It wasn't really known for digging that deeply into stuff. And so it was a bit of an odd development that the stuff I was developing and that Barger then and I worked together on. Didn't have an easy home in the Associated Press. And then was another complication, which was that Terry Anderson, who was the AP bureau chief in Beirut, had been kidnapped.
Chained by the radiator and all that.
Right, by terrorists connected to Iran, that was the belief. So you had the AP bureau chief and other senior executives working with Oliver North. Because Oliver North had 2 portfolios basically. He had the Contras in Central America, and he had the terrorism portfolio in the Middle East. So he was the guy that they had to go to get help on Terry Anderson, which was a tremendously high priority, and you can understand why for the AP. We were writing stories about North's activities in Central America that were causing him grave difficulty. We almost got moving toward getting him fired. So the AP was sort of caught in the middle at a high level, and they shielded us from that knowledge as best they could.
So they didn't say, Bob, don't you give a damn about Terry?
No, right. But we, for instance, we had a bunch of stories ready to go in May of 1986. They all reported, all written, ready to go, and they ran into a wall. And
what did you think was going on?
Well,
you didn't know about the...
Well, we figured out that it had something to do with Terry Anderson, but we did not know until later that it was in May of 1986 when Oliver North had made his famous trip to Iran with the Bible and the cake, trying to get Terry Anderson's freedom. So it appeared that AP's never admitted this, not the people I've talked to at senior levels, but it seemed logical that they were holding on to those stories because they did not want to disrupt North's efforts to get Anderson freed. But if you get into the granular level of the Contra drug story,
yes.
If you get to December of 1985, we prepared this story and we'd gone through all this material. We had a couple of dozen sources by then, and we had documents. We had the story nailed. AP was quite nervous. Actually, they were partly nervous because we'd identified a guy named Manuel Noriega, the leader of Panama, as involved in the drug trade. At that time, it was very sensitive. So basically, we thought we had it. We thought we were ready to go. We thought we had approval. I sent the final version into the bureau chief with his initials at the top, which is how we do things. And so it went in. It was carried into his office. And then a bit later, he came out and said, "Bob, I don't know how to tell you this, but I ran it past people in New York, and they really think we shouldn't run it." However, because AP is a large organization, a copy of the story with the bureau chief's initials at the top went to the Spanish language people. And so they simply translated it into Spanish and sent it out. So a day or two later, Barger got a call from someone in Venezuela saying, "We love your story." and he didn't know what to make of it, so we sort of tracked this back. And I had to sheepishly go into the bureau chief's office and say, "I think we've got a problem with that. The story is already out." And then they decided that they would put it out in English, but they took out the reference to Noriega because that was really we couldn't go that far. But That's how that story ultimately moved.
You're so genial in telling these stories, but yet we know from this recording you've got brass. What was that conversation like when your bureau chief friend said, "Bob, I don't know how to tell you this, but we're not going to run this story"? You got this amazing story. What did you say?
Well, we had fights. I mean, there was no question about it. There was.
You said why? He said what?
Well, there was a point in that May 1986 period where I wrote to Walter Mears, who was then my executive editor, and I said, "Walter, if you don't want me on this topic, I'll quit. I'll quit. I'll move on to something else, but I'm not going to continue this way." And he said, "Oh no, we really still want you to do it." But they were obviously torn, and it became this. And basically, by the time we get to the summer of '86, Barger had decided to leave.
Is it true or was he fired?
No. Basically, what happened with Barger was that because I'd arranged his hire, but he was hired as a maternity relief appointment because he was
what you can do in 9 months. I'll tell you that.
I know, but basically, Barger at AP you're supposed to come in, do all your grunt work. You're hired in a small bureau. You work all these hours, then you maybe get to the national desk. Then you have to work a bunch of more night shifts and all the rest of it. So Barger came in this unusual way, which was through this as a maternity relief appointee, and so he and I worked during that time, and then they decided they were going to put him on the overnight desk, which he didn't really like. So he worked on the overnight desk for a while, and then decided that was not going to be what he wanted to continue doing, so he left.
AP has its ways. This is just great stuff, and as I listen to it, I'm just overwhelmed with the sense of how little goes on in this kind of endeavor right now. It goes on, but not nearly enough. I can't get enough of this. Would you take us back upstream, or just with this? Would you take us back to Cyrus Hashemi, the October surprise, and how you worked your way into that story? And for some people here who were not born,
Yeah.
take us to the import of that and how you discovered what you discovered.
Basically, what happened with the October surprise story, which is the October surprise issue, is about whether or not the Republicans in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running against President Jimmy Carter, whether or not the Republicans went behind Carter's back and made contact with Iranians and had them delay the release of the American hostages.
400 and
there were 52 of them who were held for 444 days ultimately. And it turned out the anniversary of them being taken was the presidential election in 1980. So it was a very high profile thing. It had been for quite a while. And Carter's failure to do it or get the hostages freed pretty much doomed his presidency and brought in Reagan.
he tried, sent choppers in, they went down in the desert.
And then negotiations failed. And then, so Americans were quite upset. They felt we'd been humiliated by the Iranians. And Carter lost in a landslide. So, but frankly, at that time, I really didn't think anything of that. I mean, I was in Washington, but it just nothing connected for me. But then the Iran-Contra scandal happened. And what we learned from the Iran-Contra scandal, which breaks in the fall of 1986, was that despite all the denials that we've been hearing from the Reagan people, including President Reagan himself, there had been that there was this effort to sell, and they had sold weapons to the Iranians in 1985 and 86, and they'd done so without telling Congress.
And taking the cash and channeled to the Contras.
And some of the cash, some of the profits were taken and channeled to the Contras. That gave the Iran-Contra scandal its name. Now, the problem there was that as we went deeper into the investigation of that, it became clear that the weapons did not begin to move in 85 like the official story was, that they'd been going much further back. And we kept tracing them back, and we got to 1981, and it became clear that Reagan, immediately after becoming president, had approved weapon sales to the Iranians.
Now, why would he do that?
And that becomes, why would he do that? And it was mostly done through the Israelis who were handling those deals at the time. And at that point, the Israelis were trying to rebuild their ties to Iran, and they were using the weapons sales as the way to do it. At that point, Iran was at war with Iraq, so there was a desperate need in Iran for more weapons. And they had American weapons, so they needed something they could use. So as we went back further and began talking to people, it became clear that there was something that had happened. And this was when I was at Newsweek. And Newsweek had no interest in pursuing any of these stories. Newsweek was hostile to the Iran-Contra story. They just didn't...
because of the Washington Post ownership connection you described, the good of the nation,
well, so, yes,
rock the boat.
Yes, there was a real feeling that for the good of the country, we just don't want to have another one of these constitutional crises where a Republican president is perhaps destroyed because of some scandal that the press has dug up. And so there was that attitude that this wasn't good for the country to do this. So there was hostility toward anyone trying to pursue it, and I was the one trying to pursue it. And it reached the point, there was such hostility that when in 1987, when the Congressional Iran-Contra report was released, I was taken aside by the bureau chief, Evan Thomas, and told, I talked to the people in New York, they do not want you to read the report.
Wow.
And so I had this argument with Evan. I said, Evan, everyone's going to be writing about this. We have to have something.
And read the report.
And he said, well, if you can find something that's not in the report, maybe we can do that. And I said, well, Evan, how can I find out what's not in the report? So,
unknown unknowns, don't you know?
So of course I read the report, and of course we had to. But and then it came to when Oliver North went on trial. That was in 1990 now, 89 or 90 in that time frame. I was told we were not going to cover the North trial. Newsweek refused to cover it.
Even with that great Boy Scout?
No, those were the hearings. This was his criminal trial. And again, I couldn't understand it, but they were so hostile to the story. And I said, but everyone else was covering it. Time's covering it. And they said, no, we've talked to the top people, and they do not want us to cover this. So we were the one major news organization that did not cover the trial.
Were they selling cocaine too?
And I reached the point, I said, well, I'm going to get blamed for this, because I'm the guy responsible, and everyone's going to be covering this trial, and even though they told me not to cover the trial, back then there was something called Federal News Service, which had just gotten started, and they did like transcripts of trials. So I arranged to get the transcripts, the daily transcripts. So I do my regular work at Newsweek, and then I'd come home at night, and some guy would show up on a motorcycle with these transcripts every day.
Badass.
And what it turned out, though, was that the transcripts had the conversations between the judge and the lawyers, which the people in the courtroom couldn't hear.
The bench.
So I was able to break some stories because I wasn't covering the trial. But it was still not something they appreciated. And so it became clear that we were not going to pursue this. But so I left, and then I got a call from Marty Smith at Frontline, and he said, listen, we're thinking about looking into this October surprise issue, whether or not the basically Iran-Contra begins in 1980, not in the mid-'80s.
And did the Reagan campaign undermine Carter's efforts to get the hostages out?
And I really didn't want to do it, frankly. I've been through a lot at that point. I was rather tired of this, but I said I really couldn't I couldn't just wimp out on it. So I came up to Boston, and met with them, and they teamed me up with this very talented producer, Robert Ross. They had what they call a high-A camera then. It was like one of the early, really portable cameras. They still had tape and everything. But so we went off and we traveled basically around the world, into Europe and into the Middle East, and interviewed people. We tracked people down and came back with a story that we were not entirely confident that we nailed it, but clearly there was interference that the Reagan people had engaged in. Now, some of the details were still somewhat murky, and over the years I've been able to fill in some of those pieces, but it was a very tough story that people just didn't really want to hear then either.
And the suggestion was that wealthy Republicans were in touch with Carter's Iran intermediary, Cyrus Hashemi, and what?
Well, Cyrus Hashemi happened to be a business. Cyrus Hashemi was an Iranian who had been sort of part of the revolution, right? He'd been on the side of the Ayatollah taking over in 1979. But he was also mostly a businessman. He was a financier. And he happened to be an associate of a guy named John Shaheen, who was a former OSS veteran. That's like the forerunner to the CIA in World War II. And Shaheen's best buddy and business partner was William Casey. So, and William Casey had been Nixon, he worked for Nixon, but he also was Reagan's campaign director in 1980, and then later became the CIA director. So Casey was like this sort of a cowboy, wild ideologue who really wanted to take it to the Ruskies, and he was very much an aggressive Cold Warrior. And he believed that Jimmy Carter was destroying the country and needed to be removed. So the connection between Cyrus Hashemi and Shaheen and Casey were important to understand this. But Shaheen was also recruited by the CIA in 1979 and 80 to work as for the Carter administration, making contacts with his former friends in Iran to help get the hostages out. And Cyrus Hashemi brings in his brother Jamshid Hashemi, who's another sort of wheeler dealer in Iran, and they're both sort of officially working for the CIA. But they have this backdoor connection to the Reagan people through Shaheen and Casey.
Carter thought they were working for him.
Right. Carter thought they were working for him. It appears that they were working for the Republicans as well. And Jamshid Hashemi, Cyrus Hashemi died before the investigation happened, but his brother described this in detail, how they arranged like a secret meeting in Madrid between Casey and some senior Iranians in the summer of 1980, just to help delay the release of the hostages.
Do you believe that all of that through the election to Reagan?
Well, I mean, it's always hard to say what leads people of the United States to vote one way or another.
Well, you know what a big deal it was at the time.
It was a big deal, no question. And the more significant thing was that Casey felt, and frankly, the vice presidential candidate George H.W. Bush felt, that this was the issue that could turn the election to Carter if he got the hostages back right before the election. It was actually George H.W. Bush who gave it the name October Surprise. He said Carter might have an October surprise to pull, which is to get the hostages out and therefore pull out the election. So from the Republican point of view, they saw Carter as trying to manipulate the situation by getting the hostages out right before the election and therefore benefiting. So in effect, assuming all this is true, and there's still some doubts in areas, but they were trying to prevent that.
I have a couple more questions, and I want to take questions from the audience. Years later, I think it's your most recent book, is America's Stolen Narrative. These are amazing stories of great consequence from that period, and you, in this most recent book, you come on up to date, and to your point about how the past isn't past, and the future is shaped by these stories, you describe even Barack Obama as trapped by false history, by a false understanding of history. Can you just share with us some of that thesis?
Well, the problem is that, I believe very strongly that narrative is how people understand events. And so a lot of what the government propagandists do is they try to create narratives that they sell to the American people. And just very briefly, going back to the period of the early 1980s, the Reagan people were focused intently on this idea that the American people were out of control, because you had issues like the Vietnam War, and there were demonstrations. There were demonstrations right here in Harvard Square, massive demonstrations, violent demonstrations, and then of course you had the Pentagon Papers, which the New York Times published. It wasn't done on some website. It was done at the New York Times. Of course, there weren't websites back then. But then you had Watergate being pursued by the Washington Post. You had the New York Times hiring Cy Hirsch, who did the Family Jewels CIA scandals of the mid to late 70s. So by that point, the American people didn't believe anything they were hearing from the U.S. government. So the trick was, how do you get the American people back on board in favor of fighting more wars and being more aggressive overseas? And the Reagan people, we now have all their documents, or a lot of their documents, and how they would phrase that was, how do you kick the Vietnam syndrome? And the way they started doing that was in the early 1980s, with Casey now at the CIA, Reagan in the White House. They sent their best propagandist, a guy named Walter Raymond Jr., from the CIA over to the National Security Council staff, and he organized interagency task forces, and they basically dissected us and how we could be brought back into line to support their foreign activities. And there was a phrase that Raymond liked. He used it all the time. He said, "We must glue white hats on our friends and glue black hats on our enemies." And that was the idea, is that you make it such an extreme thing that so in this case the Contras were the moral equals of the founding fathers, which is a phrase that Reagan used about them, which I found rather comical.
It's like, okay.
But I'm not sure about our founding fathers, but I mean, it may have been more of an insult to them. But then gluing black hats on the Sandinistas, and the Sandinistas were certainly they had problems, but they weren't the totalitarian dungeon that Reagan described them as. So, but that was the game. And if a reporter or a human rights activist or some congressional investigator were to say, "Gee, you know, it's really it's so much grayer than that. You can't be that black and white," then that person becomes a Sandinista apologist, and that person gets attacked and criticized and humiliated and marginalized as best they can. And this is a scheme and a process that's been used over and over and over again. I mean, one can go back to the Iraq War when, you know, obviously the black hat was Saddam Hussein, and anything they said about him, no one could question. He's working with Al-Qaeda, he's got weapons of mass destruction he's lying about, and so forth. Anyone who said, "Hold it, that's really not supported by the evidence," was the Saddam apologist, and no one wanted to do that. So it was a way of intimidating and quieting people from being independent and expressing dissent. So that process was going on and on and on through this whole period. And I think, your entry point was?
The question was how you see or have seen Barack Obama as entrapped by this false history, as you described.
Right. So all these narratives get going, and they don't really stop. And I'm not sure how much President Obama understands about this history, because it has been very badly written. Our recent history is a mess. I don't think people understand some of these key points. They remain controversial even when they've been proven. The Contra drug case, for instance, it remains a controversial issue, even though the CIA in 1998 came out with an Inspector General's report admitting to it. But at that point, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times did not want to revisit the story. Because in many cases, they had been criticizing those of us reporting it back in the 1980s, and then when the Contra drug story was revived by Gary Webb in 1996, they trashed him. So when the CIA admitted to it, it was sort of an uncomfortable situation for the big press, and they mostly dealt with it by ignoring it. So some of these things are still controversial, but even though they've been established by historical record. So it's not clear to me how much President Obama understands about this recent history. He was not someone who did not come up in Washington. He was based in Illinois as a state senator. So he may not know a lot of this history, and probably didn't really bother to try to master it. But much of the same techniques that have been used to create these black-hatted villains continues to the present. That's how we treat everybody now. With Saddam Hussein was a good case. We're seeing it with Assad, we see it with Putin, we see it over and over and over again, where instead of people saying, well, yeah, there are real problems with those people, but you can't say that you can't just put the black hat on them. It turned out that it was much easier to put black hats on people than white hats. Because with white hats, it's sort of easy to sort of say about the Contras, for instance, these guys aren't white hats.
So great.
But it was easier to sort of demonize the Sandinistas than it was to make the Contras into angels. And that process, I think they learned that Americans are inclined to believe the worst of some of these foreign leaders. And if you create that dynamic, that narrative, Americans have a hard time getting around it.
You boil that down to a description as false history. That puts it at a kind of a remove. But as we listen to you tell these stories here this evening, what a privilege. This is really a privilege and important to hear. What it sounds like is an accumulation of inadequate or or negligent or corrupted press coverage. It seems to amount in total to a kind of profound failure of the American news media. It creates cumulatively false history.
Yes, I mean, I think there's the old argument that the press it writes the first draft of history. We've written a really bad first draft. And I'm not sure the historians are in any position to correct it, frankly. I think what we've seen is a careerism that has also infected our business. And I think this also, I would go back to I.F. Stone and his views on some of these matters. There is this sense among journalists that they have to keep their jobs. Crazy idea. They have families to support. They don't want to be on a
website in 1995.
They can start a website. Yeah. So I think when you have the consolidation of the press and you have now fewer and fewer newspapers, that adds to the conformity. In the old days, I don't want to bore people, but in the old days, if there were like 3 or 4 papers in your city, and you had a fight with your editor because he wouldn't run a story, and you'd say, I quit, and you'd storm down the street to the next newspaper, and he'd hire you, and you'd run the story there. There aren't those extra newspapers anymore. If there's one newspaper in a city, you're lucky. So what you end up with are journalists much more, I think, afraid of clashing with their executives over a story. And so they tend to be more willing to sort of go along with whatever the conventional wisdom is, whatever the groupthink is. And this groupthink problem has become a real danger to the nation and to the world. We certainly saw that with Iraq. It's always easier, I guess, in looking back to sort of say, well, that was a real dumb groupthink. It's harder when you're dealing with things more current. But in the case of something like
Iraq,
Iraq,
see it as recurring and at this point congenital.
Right. There's such a conformity in official Washington now about how you view things, how you view these issues. And if you're out of line, you're immediately marginalized. You're called names. You can be, if you're a Saddam apologist or a Assad apologist or a Sandinista apologist or a Putin apologist. There are all these different, that's how they label you.
And well-paid or well-organized attack dogs who can be sicked on you.
Right, and we've seen that too, where even from the days in the 80s, we had like Accuracy in Media, which was a well-funded right-wing group that went after journalists who tried to tell the truth on difficult issues. That's now become almost institutionalized in different ways as well. So what you have is a very hostile environment for telling the truth, and journalists have increasingly chosen not to. Or they'll go along with the conventional wisdom, they'll be part of the group thing. And the amazing thing about the Iraq War was there was almost no accountability. It's one thing to sort of get everything wrong, and you had this massive groupthink where the Washington Press Corps totally bought into these false stories, and then after it was exposed, there really wasn't much punishment. I've seen journalists destroyed over some minor mistake, or some even not a mistake, that people say was a mistake or something. And you've seen this with like Mary Mapes at CBS, you saw it with Gary Webb at San Jose Mercury News. Yet journalists who were involved in one of the biggest failures that we've seen in modern history just all walked away and they still write their columns in the Washington Post. They still have their jobs at the New York Times.
Because they stayed on board.
It turns out there is safety in numbers. That's what they've always said, and it turns out to be correct.
I suspected, but honestly I didn't fully anticipate the gravity of this conversation. I feel like I should share. If there are questions, please. Maybe we start over here? No?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
I read a book pertaining to Iran-Contra. It was called The Prophets of War, Profits, and it was written about the Mossad by a Mossad agent. And it was written to save his life. It's in Coolidge Corner Public Library, and I'd actually have to check the web right now to find out what his name was because I forget it. And he talks about the extremely poor quality weapons that the Israelis were selling to the Iranians. And they were able to get away with it because nobody was supposed to be selling weapons to the Iranians. And the other thing he talked about was, there was a lot in the book, but I think it's worth reading, was how Carter was the only one who did not know what was going on. The Republicans sort of controlled the situation, and it's not a partisan thing. He just was out of the loop, and they did it specifically, so to prevent him being elected.
Bob, any comment on that?
Everybody-
Well, the author was, his name is Ari Ben Menashe.
I'm sorry.
And his name is Ari Ben Menashe.
Yeah.
And he was not actually in the Mossad, he was in Israeli military defense, or he was in the military intelligence.
Oh, okay.
And he was close to, he was very much Likudnik at the time. I've interviewed him. I spent time actually in jail with him. One reason he sort of fell out with the Israelis was that he was part of this effort, went over a number of years with the Israelis to sell weapons to the Iranians, and he ran afoul of U.S. Customs on one of the sales of a plane to Iran, and they arrested him in Los Angeles and brought him to New York to stand trial. And I was with Newsweek at the time. It was 1990, and I flew into Manhattan. I'd been looking for this guy because his name had been in the Iran-Contra world. He was like this mysterious Israeli agent that we kind of knew was out there, but I couldn't find him. And actually, I got a call from a fellow reporter saying, "He's still looking for this guy?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, you may be able to find him now because he's in MCI in Lower Manhattan." So I arranged to go and interview him, I was quite surprised by that interview because he was in his beige prison jumpsuit, but he was very proud, and you could tell this guy was a well-trained intelligence officer, and he basically told me, "You don't know Iran-Contra." And I thought I kind of knew Iran-Contra, but he said, "You don't know really what the background story was." And so he began talking, and then he went on trial and he was acquitted by a jury in New York because they believed, and they believed accurately, that he really was an Israeli intelligence officer. After I interviewed him, I went back to my Newsweek office in Washington, and we checked him out. And at first the Israelis denied that he worked for them at all. They said he was an imposter. But then I was able to get documents showing that he indeed had worked for them and had been considered a very promising intelligence officer. And then they confirmed that, yeah, he did work for them. They tried to minimize his role, but he clearly was a key figure in that operation. He was an Iraqi Jew born in Iran, spoke Farsi. He emigrated to Israel when he was like 16. So that's sort of the background. But yeah, so there's some interesting things of that sort that, and the book has just been, I think, republished.
Open any window on this man. It's pretty good, sir.
Speaking of challenging narratives, can I press you a bit on the Newsweek's desire to protect the Republic? Are you talking about the Graham family? Can you get specific? I mean, who was making those decisions?
What council of elder gray-haired...
Popular, Katharine Graham is a hero, right? And all the President's Men and so forth. So, I mean, who was making that kind of a decision for the good of the Republic?
Well, basically, the senior executives at Newsweek who were appointed by Katharine Graham. Maynard Parker, for instance, who was the executive editor when I was there, he was basically my nemesis. And when you're a correspondent and someone's the executive editor, it's not always a fair fight. But
nemesis.
But there was this occasion on. I just got into Newsweek. It was in 1987, and Newsweek would have these dinners. They had these dinners for like newsmakers, and people would come down to from New York to be part of these dinners. And these were often at Evan Thomas's house in Northwest D.C. And this one, the two guests of honor was Brent Scowcroft, who at that time had just been part of the initial investigation of Iran-Contra, it was called the Tower Board, and Brent was one of 3 people on it. And the other guest of honor was Dick Cheney, who at that time he was a congressman, and he was about to become the senior Republican on the Iran-Contra investigation on the Hill. And at one point during this very nice little dinner, it was like with salmon and asparagus and things. It was, a waiter came by with, filled the glasses with wine. There was, Scowcroft said, I probably shouldn't say this, he said, But if I were advising Admiral Poindexter, who had been the national security advisor for Reagan, and if Admiral Poindexter had told the president about the diversion of the money from the Iran's weapon sales to the Contras, I'd advise him to say that he hadn't. And so I put down my fork and I said,
Lovely holidays.
I said, General, you're not suggesting that the admiral should commit perjury, are you? And my side was Maynard Parker, and he, in a booming voice, said, sometimes we have to do what's good for the country. And it was like some manly guffawing around the table, and it was quite clear that that I really didn't quite get it. So I mean and it was just that one joke, whatever it was meant as.
But very
Be
telling.
one thing, but it was actually what they actually felt, as they expressed multiple times to me in various ways.
It's a great question. Can I take the liberty of just following up and ask you about the Jason Rezaian situation? Do you have any special insight on that? He's in prison in Iran. He's a Washington Post guy. Is there a secret history at work here?
I really don't.
Okay. Yes.
Sir, I think this is the best talk I've ever attended in my life. I want to ask you about the recent Seymour Hirsch story about Osama bin Laden, and did you read the New York Times magazine story about this? It strikes me that it's similar to the pattern you described, where when someone goes off the script, then there's a sort of rallying of people ridiculing him. But it's so many of the people are serious national security reporters who are raising questions about his story. It's that you have to wonder: is it that, or is it that his story is weird? And do you know?
Well, I have no real direct knowledge on that. I do know Cy, and I have great respect for his work. I think he's one of the great investigative journalists in American history. He can be a little eccentric at times, but all of us can be. One has to remember Cy's history. I mean, if you go back through it, he's best known, I guess, for the My Lai massacre exposure back in the late 1960s. But he also did the Family Jewels CIA stories for the New York Times. More recently, he was involved in breaking the Abu Ghraib scandal in Iraq. All these things were denied or spun differently by the government as he was trying to break them. These weren't easy stories. So I think you have to put that into the picture. Now, I would just say that my guess is, and I really don't have direct knowledge, but that probably there's some mix of truth and maybe being off mark a bit on some of this. I think the story was very neatly told by the government about the execution or the killing of Osama bin Laden. But I think that was probably a little too neat. And I think what Cy provided was some of the other side of it. But whether all his story is correct, he's obviously working with a source or two that he has. Other people who I think are pretty good journalists have their sources, and they see it more as the government has sort of presented it. I don't know, but I do think it's probably, my guess would be it's a mix of those two things.
As a follow-up, sir, can I ask you, do you think that in the internet era, it gets a little harder to silence dissenting voices and to sandbag journalists who are reporting inconvenient truths?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's the ability to get information out. The problem becomes how many people you can get it to. I mean, theoretically, you can get it to pretty much everybody, but back when we started, there weren't that many websites, but then a lot of folks weren't on the internet either. So now there are like a gazillion websites, and it's hard for people to sort of know what they want to read and what's good. And of course, you also have on the internet a lot of stuff that's terrible. You have things that are made up, you have crazy conspiracy theories, you have falsified documents, fake pictures, you can have all kinds of things. And one has to be extremely careful. I did a piece the other day about the need to not just accept everything you sort of find if you're trying to get photographs, say in the case of the MH17 situation or other things like that, you can be misled. The agency people I've known, or some of I once interviewed General Lansdale, who was like the father of the PSYOPs, back from the days of the Philippines insurrection and Vietnam. And And Lansdale always said, he said, the key thing is not to get your stories in the controlled press. The key thing is to get your stories into the press that people think is independent and trustworthy, because they'll be open to that. So there was always this game of how you sort of sneak your stories to the public, and the internet would be like a devil's playground for some of these guys, because it's so easy to kind of get things out. They look very real, but I do think there's a need to be have very high standards of trying to evaluate what you're looking at. So I think in a way, you can get information out perhaps more easily, but you also have to be careful. And that's always a problem.
Yeah.
Thank you. I agree that it's the best talk I've ever been to. I'm really curious to your take on the Gary Webb series. First of all, do you think it's was basically credible? Secondly, if you were his editor, would you have had him do something differently? And thirdly, did the disparaging of that series have any impact on you and the credibility of your own work looking back?
Well, I knew Gary Webb. I got to know him reasonably well. He actually called me before he wrote his series. And he sort of described what he was working on. And it was something different from what we had done. Our stories were focused on what was happening in Central America. That the Contras were sending the cocaine into the United States, or helping to get it here. His story was what happened to it once it got here.
This is the crack cocaine story in LA.
Right, that
Also
that
back to
had
the
gone in,
Contras.
that some of the cocaine had gone into LA and been turned into crack, and then helped feed into the crack epidemic, which was so devastating to especially African American communities. So, I said to Gary, I said, are your editors behind you? Because that's going to be crucial on this one. He said, oh yeah, they're solid, they're behind me. He thought they were. And they were, I guess, at that point. So he ran his series. Now, the three-part series he did in August of 1996, you could argue that he maybe should have put in some more background. He says he did, his editors kind of took it out. Because there was a lot of history already. There had been not just our reporting back in 85, 86, but there was the Kerry investigation. Senator Kerry had done an investigation which advanced this quite a bit by 89.
Could we just stipulate, for those who don't know, that the LA Times and others came back in and said that his claims were overstated. So this is great.
Right. So basically, after Webb's stories came out, instead of the major press saying, this is a good chance to now revisit a very serious story that had been sort of dismissed and not treated with the seriousness it deserved at the time. Instead, it was easier to destroy Gary Webb. So the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times just did a tag team wrestling match and just kicked the crap out of Gary Webb. And to such a degree, they made issues out of things that really weren't that important, like the graphic that was used, which showed someone with a CIA seal and some smoking crack, and it was like a graphic. But that became a big issue, and so Webb was ridiculed and laughed at, and so was the black community, because the black community was demanding a serious investigation. So what happened with that was that Webb's editors got cold feet. There was San Jose Mercury News. They're part of the Knight Ridder chain at that point.
And to further clarify the gravity, Gary Webb committed suicide in December 2004.
Right. So, but basically, Webb was destroyed, and his editors humiliated him and forced him to resign. Now, what he did do, and I was in touch with him during this period, but he forced the government to start really investigating. And there was a report by the Justice Department's Inspector General. There were 2 reports by the CIA's Inspector General, especially the CIA's Inspector General, a guy named Frederick Hitz, was a really kind of a stand-up guy, and he went back and really went through this, and he showed what I was talking about earlier, that the Contra drug problem begins in 1980 and runs all the way through the decade. Now. And that comes out in 1998. So Webb has already been sort of destroyed. His career has been destroyed. He's been ridiculed and laughed at. And so when the CIA comes out with this, the New York Times did do a piece, kind of a semi-mea culpa sort of piece, but not very much attention was paid to it. The Washington Post just sort of kissed off the report. And the LA Times just didn't want to deal with it at all, because they were being shown now to have been, not only did they missed this story when it happened in the 1980s, they then destroyed a reporter who tried to bring it back in the 1990s. But instead of saying, we really screwed up, we should be ashamed of ourselves, they just tried to pretend it didn't happen. So Webb his career was never put back on track. He remained this pariah, couldn't get work anywhere. And eventually, his marriage broke up. He couldn't pay his child support. He couldn't get really any kind of paying job, and he was being kicked out of some house that he'd been moved into. He was going to have to move back in with his mother, because that's the only place he could go. And then she chose to end his life.
All this despite his basic claims were essentially been.
Yeah, they were true. I mean, one could have done it differently, but it was true.
Did the initial reaction to his reporting have any repercussion on your own work? Did people start to question your work?
Well, our work had been questioned already. And so, by the way, was Senator Kerry's investigation, which was a very good investigation, very gutsy investigation, rare to see in the Senate. He put out a report in 1989 that was, again, generally laughed at, dismissed by the major news organizations. This was a story they did not want to deal with. It didn't matter how much evidence you had. It didn't matter how well documented it was. This was one of these things where the major news media had decided this was, I guess, not good for the country, and that they weren't going to go with it. So we ended up with it. This is part of the problem. If you reach the point when even serious investigations, well documented, well reported, are ignored or treated as if they're fiction or something, a democracy can't work that way. The whole point of all this is that the people have to be empowered with the information. And that's what they understood back when Walter Raymond and Bill Casey were doing these things back in the 1980s. They knew they had to take that power away from the American people. They had to get controls of the narrative. They had to sort of sell it to you with black hats, white hats, these simplistic storylines. So the American people would fall in line. And if the American people were continued to be informed, as they were being informed in the 1970s, it would be very hard to get the American people to go off on the next adventure. You know, if the American people understood how this game was being played, they might have looked at the Iraq War very differently from the beginning.
If I were king of all media, I'd give you a cable channel and ask you just to talk all day for about 2 years. We're over time, but a couple more. You were asking, sir, is it relevant?
Yes, Robert, you please elaborate a little bit the way that the Argentine intelligence were working with the conference. And then after, as I follow very close all the issue of Oliver North and Contras several years ago, it happened to me to be involved in some way. So the fellow who was killed in Colombia, working to the same institutions that were involved, the Department of State, the Department, the DIA, and the CIA. And I found that the $6 billion that just on the Colombian plan against the drugs were involved in that. And I was involved in suing the three institutions. Could you in some way relate those Argentinians to what is going on now in Colombia and the plan the States has to Colombia?
Well, I'm not sure I can. Obviously, my knowledge on those things is somewhat spotty. There are things I focus on rather intently, but then you move on to other stories, and so things happen that you just don't stay on top of. And I have to apologize for not being on top of what you're talking about. There was obviously a great deal of complexity and I think wrongdoing in some of the war on drug aspects of that. But I really haven't been covering it the way I would need to give you a good response.
We're over time, but one back here. And
thanks and congratulations, Bob. Appreciate your work. Of course, I'm always mindful of, often of I.F. Stone's comment, never believe anything until it has been officially denied. I want to ask, in the family jewels things you alluded to, there was talk about the relationship between the CIA and media assets, individuals, media institutions. Blowback has a different meaning in that context. You plant the story, you surface it in another country, gets blown back to the US by AP assets, and then it appears in US media. Just as one example. So could you talk about the relationship between, historically, and do you think it's something to be concerned about today, between institutions like the CIA and media and specific people in the media? And to juice up the question, years ago I remember when Jim Thompson was the curator of the Nieman Foundation, he was giving a talk to some graduate students about career opportunities, and I think maybe just because he wanted to show that he didn't care what anybody thought, he said, and I encourage you to consider a career in the CIA. And then years later, I saw the obituary in the New York Times for his brother, who had actually been in the CIA. So, what do you think of that?
Just to clarify, again, family jewels, there's reports of skeletons from the CIA closet, illegal, inappropriate activities have gone from like the 50s to the 70s.
Including efforts to control the press or to have people in the media acting as assets. And I don't know, I can't say much about, I've never actually encountered direct evidence that any colleague or someone I know was working on the payroll of the Central Intelligence Agency. I think many of these things have become more diffused over years. You don't really have to work for the CIA, that's sort of the way it was framed before. Now what you have, and we're seeing this even currently, is that other US government entities, like the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up in 1983 in a way to sort of take over some of those duties from the CIA. That group still exists. It gets $100 million a year, and it supports journalists and other people of that sort, activists.
My niece
supposedly
worked there. I had a niece who worked there, yeah.
Right, who supposedly are promoting democracy. Now, so you have people who have their interests being turned in certain ways by the money. We have USAID, for instance, now providing money to some journalistic organizations overseas and even to some degree in the United States, where they then go after corruption, like in a government that the United States now disfavors might be targeted for corruption investigations. And since all governments have corruption, you're going to find some wherever you go. So anyway, so I think you do see similar patterns. And plus, the bigger way that I think the national security apparatus controls the reporters is by giving you tidbits of information. And I'll be very brief on this, but basically, people don't understand that if you cover national security, it's probably the most controlled beat you could possibly be on. Because sourcing is so hard. It's hard to find. If you find someone who's willing to leak to you, that person may very well be prosecuted these days. So you're dealing with very few people that you can trust. But then the national security apparatus, their PR offices, often saying sourcing, they'll pretend like they're unnamed so it sounds more believable. They will then give information to favorite journalists. And if, say when I was at Newsweek, if one of these operatives were to give a story to Time that may not have been, maybe more propaganda than true, and Time runs it, the AP executives come back to me and yell and say, why don't you have that?
Why you know?
And the reason you may not have it is because they don't like you. Because they may think you've caused us too much grief over the years. We're not going to give you that story. And we'll give it to somebody else and make you look bad. So that's, in my experience, that's more the way it's worked.
It's been a remarkable 2 hours, and going well over now, and I apologize for that. And I'm sorry, I just can't get to everything here. There's been more in this than I expected, and it's unsettling at a deep level, but right alongside that is the respect and pride I feel in your work, Parry, and the honor in sharing this dais with you this evening. Bill, this has been a lot, and I wish you'd give us a little benediction, if you would, on the weight and implications of this witness that we've heard, or Anne-Marie. This implicates many people in your business and mine in a rather profound way. Do you have 2 words to say to it?
No, I just spent my life in the business of trying to verify information, and he is the perfect example of what we all believe journalism is all about. I don't want to put a down note on it, but I've got to do it. I think Robert is going to keep doing what he's doing. I wish his work was carried on the front page of the New York Times. But my concern is that even the best journalists today have difficulty doing the kind of work he's doing. We read the New York Times every day, but every reporter who's working for the New York Times, even the investigative reporters, have to deal with the website newspaper, which means every 45 minutes they have to stop reporting and update the story that's on the web. You can't run an investigative piece breaking off every 45 minutes to update.
From the ladies' room in the basement of the parking lot of the Capitol building.
And the best reporting is investigative reporting. I've never liked the term investigative reporting because I believe all reporting is investigative reporting. It's almost impossible for the daily journalist to do that now. And our only hope is the kind of work you're showing, the impact of that work, and our hope of the committee was that we would elevate your work among people like this, and they would go out and talk to people so more people would know what you're doing. We've got to find, the Nieman program has to find a way to make this kind of journalism standard and better known outside this room. And Tom, you did a great job bringing it.
Can I ask you one question, and that is, given what's happened with Snowden and Manning, are your sources just going to dry up? I mean, the fact that Obama used a 1917 law against him for, and he's been called a terrorist by Snowden's been called a terrorist, and Hillary Clinton just denounced him during the debate. What is going to happen to the sources given what I consider a very hard attack today?
They're drying up, as Myra. It's harder and harder to get people to talk. Back in the day, it was never easy, but you could have sort of friendly conversations with intelligence people. And like I said earlier, I would come up back from Central America or from Miami, where I'd be talking to the Contras, and I could then sit down with some agency people, and they would, I could bounce things off them, and they would confirm things for me. But it was all done. It was all accepted. It was the way it worked, and it helped them too. It helped the government understand things better, and it helped the journalists understand things better, and therefore the public understand things better. This current climate is poisonous, and I've had sources, people that, for instance, on this issue of the Malaysian airline flight, there are CIA analysts who have very different views in terms of analyzing it than have been expressed by the government more officially, and they don't want to talk because they say if they ever talk to me directly, they've been talking to me through an intermediary, if they talk to me directly, they could be prosecuted. And so no one wants to get prosecuted. So what we're seeing is even a worse situation under President Obama than I've ever experienced before.
If there's a benefactor in the hall to swing in behind consortium news, swinging behind consortium news. Robert Parry, congratulations on your outstanding award. Thank you very much.